The chandelier above me glowed too brightly, catching on the diamond ring in my hand as applause swelled around the room, thick and heavy like humid air before a storm. My fingers felt numb, the velvet box warm against my palm, while my heartbeat stayed strangely calm, almost distant. In that moment, surrounded by polished smiles and crystal glasses, I realized everyone thought this was my fairy tale ending, except me. If you've ever been praised for a life that wasn't really yours, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from, because moments like this don't happen the way we imagine. I stood there breathing in expensive perfume and old money, noticing how easily people celebrated something they didn't understand. The room shimmered with approval, but underneath it, something was already cracking. I just didn't know yet how deep the fracture went, or how carefully it had been planned. Let me show you how it all began. I felt it the second I crossed the threshold of the Caldwell estate, a tightening in my chest that told me I was being measured before I was known. The house was stunning in the way museums are stunning, beautiful, expensive, and strangely cold. Crystal lights scattered across marble floors, but none of it softened the air. My name is Claire Morgan. I am in my early 30s, and I was standing there as Ethan Caldwell's fiancée. Already aware that something about me disappointed them, I hadn't spoken, I hadn't smiled wrong. Still, eyes moved over my simple dress and sensible shoes, lingering just long enough to draw conclusions. It felt less like being welcomed and more like being sorted. Every detail around me signaled power. The portraits, the furniture, the quiet confidence of people who never had to explain themselves, and yet, the warmth you expect in a family home was missing. What I felt instead was assessment, polite and sharp, wrapped in silence. I realized then that this moment mattered. This was not a visit that could be redone. As I stood, it became clear this was not about knowing me. It was about deciding where I belonged. I followed Ethan deeper into the house, aware that every room was designed to impress rather than welcome. The furniture looked untouched, the kind chosen for appearance, not comfort. Even the air felt curated, cool and controlled, as if warmth had been edited out on purpose. His mother, Margaret Caldwell, moved through the space with practiced authority. She didn't need to raise her voice or issue commands. Her presence alone seemed to set the temperature of the room. When her attention passed over me, it felt brief and complete, like a checklist quietly marked. I wasn't invited in, I was acknowledged. Ethan's sister, Lauren, was sharper in her energy. She carried herself with an ease that comes from never needing approval. Her glances lingered just long enough to register disinterest before sliding away. It wasn't cruelty. It was dismissal, delivered casually, as if I were a detail that didn't matter enough to examine closely. What unsettled me most was how little anyone had to say. Polite smiles replaced questions, pauses stood in for conversation. Silence did the work, words didn't need to do. I could feel myself being placed somewhere lower, not through insults, but through omission. Ethan stood beside me, close enough to touch, yet strangely distant. When moments arrived where I expected reassurance or quiet defense, none came. His body language shifted, smaller somehow, careful. I realized he was managing the room, not protecting me. That was when something clicked. This wasn't about money or manners, it was about control, about teaching people where they belonged, and standing there, I understood my place had already been decided. I felt the urge to explain, to defend, to correct their assumptions, but instinct told me to wait. Sometimes, watching quietly teaches you more than speaking could. That night, I listened. I stood there with all the explanations lined up in my head, every credential, every detail that could have corrected their assumptions, and I chose not to use any of them, not because I felt small, but because something in me went still. I realized defending myself would only feed a game I never agreed to play. Over the years, I learned that silence can be active. It can be a decision, growing up. I watched people rush to prove themselves, and I noticed how rarely that changed anyone's mind. What it did change was the power dynamic. The moment you explain yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you, you hand them control. That lesson came from my grandmother, the woman who raised me. She lived simply, spoke carefully, and never hurried to announce who she was. As a child, I mistook that for humility. As an adult, I recognized it as discernment. She understood that people behave differently when they think you have nothing to offer them, and she paid attention to that version of them. Standing in that house, I felt her presence more clearly than ever. I remembered how she taught me to observe first, react later, to let people reveal themselves fully before deciding how much access they deserved. So I stayed quiet. I smiled when appropriate. I listened more than I spoke. And in that silence, I wasn't shrinking. I was gathering information. Because there was a part of my story they didn't know yet. I need you to know something I never said out loud that night. Something the Caldwell family never bothered to ask. I work in technology, but not in the vague, supportive way Ethan seemed comfortable imagining. I am a senior software architect for a national firm, responsible for systems used by millions of people every day. I have been writing code since I was a teenager. I built my first product in my early 20s. I earn my living comfortably, independently, and quietly. I live within my means by choice, not limitation. None of this was hidden behind lies. I answered every question truthfully. I simply stopped filling in the blanks for people who never asked. Ethan assumed what suited him. When I said I worked in tech, he decided what that meant. When I dressed simply, he translated it into something smaller. I noticed how easily he accepted a version of me that required no curiosity. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter. Now I understand it was information. I am telling you this because it changes how that evening looks. The glances, the silence, the polite dismissal were built on a story they invented. And you are the only ones hearing the truth before they do. That truth was never about money or status. It was about agency, about knowing who I am even when no one else does. And as I stood in that house, letting them underestimate me, I carried something they couldn't see yet, something that would matter very soon. It stayed with me quietly, steady and unannounced, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be protection, but preparation. And when everything they overlooked would finally step into the light on its own terms without my needing to raise my voice. Watching Ethan that night felt like meeting a quieter version of someone I thought I knew. His shoulders curved inward as the evening went on. His voice softened. His confidence dimmed in ways I had never seen when we were alone and around me. He was open, future-focused, certain. In that house, he became careful, almost childlike, as if every movement needed approval before it could exist. I noticed how often he looked toward his mother before speaking, how quickly he retreated into silence when tension hovered. Moments that asked for reassurance passed without response, not because he disagreed, but because he didn't want to risk disfavor. At first, I told myself he was nervous, that family dynamics can make anyone revert to old habits. But the longer I watched, the harder that explanation became to believe. This wasn't a one-time hesitation, it was a pattern. Ethan had learned that love in that family came with conditions, earned through compliance and quiet agreement. And standing there beside him, I realized he was still playing by those rules. What hurt wasn't that he didn't challenge them openly, it was that he didn't even seem to consider choosing differently. His silence wasn't confusion. It was comfort. He knew how to survive in that space. And survival meant not rocking the structure that defined him. I began to wonder what that meant for us, for a future built inside that system. Would there ever be a moment when he chose partnership over permission, truth over ease? Or was I standing next to someone who would always shrink when it mattered most? That question stayed with me, unanswered, settling quietly between us. Her name surfaced halfway through the evening, dropped into the room with an ease that made it feel intentional. It wasn't announced or explained. It was mentioned the way people reference something everyone is expected to recognize. I felt it before I understood it, a sudden shift in the air, a tightening just behind my ribs. I watched Ethan the moment it happened. His body reacted before his face could catch up. A pause, a barely visible stiffness, then control again. It was small, but I noticed, because by then I was paying attention to everything he didn't say. That was when I understood this wasn't just a memory being shared, it was a comparison being made. The woman they spoke of fit neatly into the story they valued. She came from the right background, the right family, the right circles. Her accomplishments were listed like credentials, her presence framed as inevitable, almost logical. I listened, calm on the outside, while something sharp settled inside me. As the evening went on, I saw her without ever meeting her. She appeared in framed photographs lining the walls, standing comfortably beside Ethan in moments that clearly mattered. Holidays, celebrations, her arm rested easily against his. Familiar and unchallenged, no one acknowledged the images. They didn't have to. I smiled when expected. I nodded at the right moments. I even felt myself respond politely to the story being told, as if it didn't reach into the center of my chest. Inside, though, everything was rearranging. I wasn't being introduced to someone from his past. I was being shown an alternative future. A question formed quietly and refused to informing. If she belonged so clearly in their world, what exactly was I doing there, and why did it feel like I was only now being made aware of the role I was expected to play? That feeling followed me as the night tightened around us, pulling me closer to a truth I hadn't seen yet, but was already moving toward. I stepped away from the main rooms, needing air, following a long hallway that felt quieter with every step. The house swallowed sound, and in that stillness, I heard voices I wasn't meant to hear. At first, they were just tones, controlled and irritated, the kind used when decisions are being made without emotion. Then I realized they were talking about me, not my feelings or my place in the family, but my usefulness. I stood frozen as understanding arrived piece by piece. This wasn't concern, it was planning. I was described as temporary, as something convenient, as a solution until something better could be secured. The word placeholder settled into me slowly, not sharp, not loud, just final. My engagement wasn't a promise. It was a holding pattern, a way to manage appearances while real negotiations continued elsewhere. And the most painful clarity of all came when I understood Ethan knew. He wasn't confused or trapped. He had agreed. He had chosen strategy over honesty and called it responsibility. I didn't cry. I didn't feel dramatic heartbreak. What I felt was a strange quiet, like something heavy finally being set down. Every moment of silence, every comparison, every absence of defense suddenly aligned into a single, undeniable truth. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be solved with a conversation. It was orchestration, deliberate and precise. I had been invited into a role, not a relationship. As I stepped back from the hallway, my hands steady despite the weight in my chest, something shifted inside me. The shock drained away, leaving clarity in its place. I knew exactly what I was dealing with now, and more importantly, I knew I would not confront it. I would let it unfold exactly as they intended, and I would be ready for this. When I returned to the sitting room, the energy had shifted. The furniture had been subtly rearranged, people positioned with intention, as if the evening had reached a scheduled point. Ethan looked at me with a tight expression that tried to pass for nervous excitement, but I recognized it now as rehearsal. He moved into the proposal the way someone follows instructions, careful, measured. His voice carried the right words, but none of the vulnerability I once expected from that moment. When he knelt, the room seemed to hold its breath, not in anticipation, but in evaluation. My eyes went to the ring. It was large, designed to be noticed from a distance. Up close, it told a different story. The setting wasn't quite balanced. The stone caught the light unevenly. It was impressive, but rushed, flashy, but imperfect. It mirrored the moment exactly. I understood the choice in front of me immediately. If I said no, I would become the disruption, the woman who embarrassed him, who failed to play her part. If I said yes, I gained time, space, control over the narrative they thought they were managing. I looked at Ethan and felt no confusion, only clarity. This wasn't a question of love. It was a move on a board that had been set long before I arrived, and I knew what came next if I let it. So I accepted, calmly, deliberately. I allowed the applause to wash over us while something settled inside me. This engagement was not a promise, it was a pause, and I had no intention of keeping it. As the ring slid onto my finger, I felt nothing romantic, only readiness. They thought the game had reached its conclusion. In reality, it had just begun. Once the engagement was announced, everything on the surface slowed down. Congratulations arrived, plans were mentioned, expectations settled into place, and beneath that calm, I shifted gears completely. This was familiar territory for me. When something doesn't add up emotionally, I look at the structure. I stopped reacting and started observing, quietly, methodically. This is how I work when I'm building systems, and it's how I approach the Caldwells. I followed paper trails instead of conversations, public records, corporate filings, patterns hidden in plain sight. I didn't need inside access to see the outlines of what was really happening. At first, it was subtle. Expansion that happened too fast, assets stretched thin, partnerships that looked impressive but carried unusual pressure. Then the inconsistencies appeared, numbers that repeated in strange increments, expenses that didn't match revenue cycles, the kind of details most people skip over because they look boring. They never are. The image the family projected was stability, legacy, control. What I found instead was fragility. Debt layered beneath confidence. Obligations stacked carefully to avoid collapse. The more I looked, the clearer it became that this engagement wasn't about celebration. It was about survival. That realization changed everything. I understood why appearances mattered so much, why timing felt urgent, why I had been slotted so neatly into place. I wasn't chosen for who I was. I was chosen for what I represented while other arrangements were being negotiated. Through it all, I played my part. I smiled when expected. I listened. I stayed agreeable. But internally, I was building a different picture. One grounded in facts instead of assumptions. And as that picture sharpened, another question surfaced. Heavier than the rest, if the family was this careful with their truth, what exactly was Ethan still hiding from me? I told myself I needed certainty, not suspicion. So one evening, when Ethan said he was meeting a client, I watched from across the street instead. I saw him arrive relaxed, unguarded, already smiling. He wasn't alone. The familiarity between them was immediate. The way they leaned toward each other, the ease of touch, the absence of distance. This wasn't coincidence or nostalgia, it was continuity. I felt the last thread of doubt loosen inside me. Still, I gave him space to choose honesty. Later that night, sitting beside him, I opened a quiet door in my own mind and waited to see if he would walk through it, if he would tell me something I already knew. He didn't. The ease returned to his voice too quickly. The reassurance landed too smoothly. That was the moment attachment gave way to clarity. I didn't feel anger. I felt finished. The version of him I loved existed only in private moments that no longer mattered. What I saw now was the whole picture. From then on, the engagement stopped being a promise. It became a timeline, a measured pause before an ending I could already see. I stayed calm. I stayed kind. The engagement party looked exactly as the Caldwells intended. White tents stretched across the lawn, soft lighting glowing against manicured hedges, conversations layered with importance, investors, partners, familiar faces who knew how to read a room. It was a celebration built to reassure, to signal stability and success. I arrived as myself, not the version they had curated, nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just accurate. I felt the shift immediately. Eyes followed me longer this time, not dismissive now, but curious, uncertain. Ethan found me quickly, his confusion flickering before he masked it. For the first time, he didn't know how to place me. When his mother stepped forward to welcome everyone, the evening reached its planned peak. I felt it when my name was called, the quiet expectancy as I walked toward the center. I accepted the microphone calmly. My hands didn't shake. My voice stayed steady. I spoke about first impressions, about silence, about how I chose to let assumptions stand so I could understand how they treated someone they believed had nothing to offer. I described that first dinner, the comparisons, the absence of curiosity. I felt the tension tighten as recognition moved through the crowd. Then I explained what the engagement had really been: a pause, a strategy, a way to manage appearances while other arrangements continued. I shared what I had learned, not emotionally, but factually. The fragile finances beneath the polish, the urgency disguised as confidence, the betrayal I had witnessed for myself. I didn't need to accuse. The truth did the work. I noticed people stepping back, expressions recalibrating, phones appearing quietly in hands. A representative near the front accepted the documents that confirmed what I'd said. The room understood before it reacted. I removed the ring and placed it into Ethan's hand. Not angrily, gently. It no longer belonged to me. I said I wouldn't marry into a family that confused control with love and silence with loyalty. Then I stepped away. No one stopped me. The space opened naturally, as if everyone knew the moment had passed. Behind me, voices rose, confidence fracturing. Ahead of me, the night air felt cool and clean. As I walked off the grounds, I didn't look back. Inside the tent, the story they had built was collapsing, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt completely free. The consequences unfolded quickly after that night, not with noise, but with distance. Calls went unanswered, meetings were postponed, then quietly canceled. People who once leaned in began to step back, creating space where certainty had been. The story moved faster than control ever could. I watched it all from the outside. Business partners withdrew support without explanation. Plans that once felt inevitable unraveled with surprising speed. Formal reviews began. Documents were requested. Titles lost their weight. The image the Caldwells had protected for so long thinned until it could no longer hold. Ethan reached out more than once. Messages arrived filled with explanations, pressure, regret. I didn't open them, not out of anger, but because there was nothing left to resolve. He had been given opportunities for honesty long before consequences arrived. He chose convenience each time. What struck me most was how ordinary the collapse felt. No dramatic confrontation. No victory speech, just the natural result of truth meeting daylight. Silence, once used as a weapon, became the absence that followed exposure. I returned to my routines, my work, my quiet apartment. Life continued without spectacle. And in that calm, I felt something settle into place. The chaos was no longer mine to observe. It belonged to the people who built it. As the noise faded, I turned inward, grateful for the stillness waiting on the other side of letting go. I returned to my apartment on a quiet morning, the kind where the city sounds softened instead of rushed. Sunlight rested on the kitchen counter. Coffee steamed slowly. Nothing was urgent, and for the first time in weeks, neither was I. Life shrank back to its proper size: work calls, grocery lists, evening walks, ordinary moments that felt steady rather than small. I realized how close I had come to trading this calm for a future built on performance, on silence mistaken for loyalty, on love that required me to disappear. I thought about my grandmother then, how she used to say that power reveals itself when you stop chasing it, that people show you who they are most clearly when they believe you have nothing to offer them. I hadn't understood those words fully when I was younger. I do now. Being underestimated turned out to be a quiet gift. It gave me time to see clearly, to choose myself without noise or spectacle. I didn't win anything that night except my own certainty, and it has proven to be enough. I don't replay the past anymore. I don't imagine alternate endings. What remains is a sense of alignment, of standing where I belong. Peace wasn't waiting at the end of confrontation. It was waiting in the decision to walk away intact. Some experiences break you open. Others close a door gently behind you. This one did both, and left me standing in a life that feels like mine. I want to speak to you directly for a moment. If you have ever been underestimated, judged quietly, or made to feel small without a single word being spoken, this story was for you. What I learned is simple but hard-earned. Your value does not rise when you explain yourself, and your strength does not require an audience. Sometimes self-respect looks like patience, silence, and the courage to walk away without proving a thing. Thank you for giving me your time, your attention, and your trust all the way through this story. It means more than you know. If this resonated with you, I invite you to like or share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you feel comfortable, tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated? And how did you choose yourself when it mattered most in your own life?